let's turn to exploring the Shema, discussions on the issues of Trinity. And again, this is paper number 2, and we are in part number 20. We just started this Let's Get a Little Bit Technical section, part of paper 2, where we are doing a kind of a case study is what I call it, a case study on a viewpoint by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Dale Tuggy, and he's a Unitarian Christian. That is to say, he believes in a God who is not tripersonal. He believes in a God who has absolute identity in and of himself, and he's numerically identical to himself and no other being. That is to say, the being known as God is not comprised of 3 persons. So Dr. Dale Tuggy, being a Christian, espouses to a biblical belief that the God of the Bible is numerically identical to the being that Jesus recognized as God the Father. They are the same, one and the same person. And therefore, since the Father just is God and God just is the Father, go back and listen to last week's commentary if you're not sure what I'm talking about. Then, or just read down through this section here that we looked at last week. This one, and this one, and this one, and then this one, and then we stopped. Here's what Tuggy says in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He states, let me go there. All right, quote, Trinitarians hold this revelation of the one God as a great self to have been either supplemented or superseded by later revelation, which shows the one God in some sense to be 3 persons. And we have some Greek terminology. We have hypostaseis, or prosopa. The Latin is personae. And I haven't looked up these Greek words, all of them myself. I'm familiar with this hypostaseis. I believe I'm saying that right. It's translated right here. I wish it was the Greek, then I could just read it that way. The hypostases or hypostasis in the singular is the concept that there are 2 natures within one being, such as Jesus has 2 natures. We call this the hypostatic union between the human nature of the man known as Jesus and the divine nature of Jesus that he possesses, which links him directly to the being called God, which gives him the right to be recognized as God. So he's 100% God based on his his deity nature, right, based on his deity, and he's 100% human based on his human nature. This gives him 2 natures, or the hypostatic union between the deity and the human. Most Trinitarians are familiar with this. Dr. Tuggy, of course, is well versed in this, being a doctor of philosophy and analytic theology himself. So these are just terms that the earlier church fathers had to wrestle with when trying to explain God. But what we end up with is a Latin term, personae, which gives rise to our English word persons. And it originally had to do with, listen to what Dr. Tuggy explains here, these divine persons, he says, are selves, right? And if these divine persons are selves, according to Dr. Tuggy, and the claim is that there are 3 divine selves, according to Trinitarian theology, which is to say 3 gods, right? So stop and listen to what Tuggy is objecting to when it comes to Trinitarian theology. We Trinitarians say that there's 1 being known as God and 3 persons known as God, or as Dr. White is fond of saying, 1 what and 3 who's, the what being God and the who's being Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And yet, this hypostatic union between persons of God and a being known as God, where at least one of the persons, the Son, has human nature, right? The other 2 persons don't. Right? The Holy Spirit does not have a human nature, and the Father has no human nature. Now, of course, the Father has incarnated himself, or we might say theophanized himself, right? We have the Old Testament theophanies where God shows up, like say to Abraham as 3 persons. 2 of them turn out to be angels, and one of them turns out to be God himself. Otherwise spoken of sometimes as 3 men or 3 angels or something to that effect. And no one simply collapses the identity of the person that stayed and spoke with Abraham in Genesis chapter 18 as God the Father, collapses the identity into Jesus. No, but we might say that this was a pre-incarnate Jesus. Particularly the angel of the Lord fits that particular description in the minds of most Christians, where Jesus is the pre-incarnate version of himself in the angel of the Lord, the Malach Adonai, that shows up in all over the Tanakh. But the person that shows up in Genesis 18, most Christians as well as Jewish authors would not call that a pre-incarnate Messiah, but would simply say that's God showing up as what we might call a theophany, or he's appearing as a human, even though God himself is not human. All right, so Tuggy's trying to say that if the identity of the being known as God is in fact a single identity, right, numerically identical to himself and no other because of the qualities and attributes that he possesses, then to describe God as divine selves, then according to the Latin understanding used, launching from this phrase personae, from which we get the word person, which actually in ancient Greek mythology was more closely tied to the three masks that an actor wore as he presented the plays, right? You had the Greek tragedies and plays, and the Greek theater, and the actors wore different masks, and those masks were actually called personae, which is interesting. But today we don't refer to it that way unless you're maybe, say, a Oneness Pentecostal. But the point being is Dr. Tuggy's trying to say that the three divine persons, if they in fact are selves, then the claim that there are three selves, such as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is actually saying the same thing, that there are three gods. That's his objection. Of course, we Trinitarians disagree. We're not saying that there are three gods. We're saying that there's one being known as God, and there's only one, but he is divisible within three persons who are separate and distinct from one another. They have their own separate identity, respective of one another. They are not simply linked to one another to the point that they are imitating one another, or Jesus is masquerading as the Holy Spirit in spirit form, or the Father is masquerading as the Son in human form, or something to that effect. They can exist consubstantially, that is to say, in union with one another, but they can also exist individually, is the point that Trinitarians try to make.